Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Well, we took a break for a couple of weeks from our review and refutation of Sam Frost's book, The Parousia of the Son of Man. I want to pick up on that today. I'm going to be focused on page 23, and I have to tell you, I'll be somewhat blunt here. You will seldom find a more egregious example of eisegesis and presupposition than what is found on page 23. In discussing Matthew chapter 24, he is discussing the disciples' question about when shall all of these things be, what shall be the sign of your parousia, and of the end of the age. Now, it is important that you understand that Sam Frost delineates between Christ's parousia, which he identifies as Christ's ascension in Acts chapter 1, to the right hand. That, for Sam Frost, is Christ's parousia. Then, he has a totally separate, totally distinct end of the age. And so for Sam Frost, the disciples, when they heard about the fall of Jerusalem, they were thinking of Christ's ascension and a far removed, totally divorced, totally distinct, coming at the annihilation of the world, as Sam Frost calls it. Now, folks, that's disingenuous. It is presuppositional on the parousia. You need to watch the debate between William Vincent and myself on Daniel chapter 7, 13 and 14. Just go to my YouTube channel and you can search for the Vincent Preston debate on Daniel chapter 7. The disciples are not asking about two totally separate events. Number one, the ascension of Christ, and number two, the annihilation of the world. Where would they have gotten the idea from anything Jesus had ever said about the annihilation of the world? There's nothing in what Jesus said about the annihilation of the world. Now, watch this. On page 23, Frost says, it should be noted that in Matthew's version, the sign about which the disciples are asking, the sign of the end of the age and Christ's parousia, is not just of his presence. You see what he's doing? But also of the end of the age. Now watch this. This is important. Which upon hearing of the destruction of the temple and its buildings carried with it a grand annihilation of the world. So Mr. Frost has essentially made an incredible and fatal admission. He admits that the prediction of the fall of the temple carried with it a grand annihilation of the world. Well, let's just face it. This alone disproves Mr. Frost, because the temple was destroyed in AD 70. Even Mr. Frost admits that. He has to. That's history. But the world was not annihilated then. Now, point number two. Mr. Frost is admitting that when Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, that the disciples thought of the end of the world. Okay, question. Were they right or were they wrong? Well, just recently, somewhat recently, on Facebook, I pointed out and I posed the questions to Mr. Frost. Did the disciples associate the fall of Jerusalem with the end of the age? Initially, he said no. When I pointed out that's the context, Mr. Frost came back and said, well, of course, the destruction of that temple would have automatically brought the end of the age to the mind of the disciples. So, Mr. Frost did a great flip-flop. A radical change about the disciples' questions. The question is, folks, and this comes back, and it comes back, and it comes back. When Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, the disciples asked about the end of the age and his parousia. Were they right or were they wrong to make that connection? If you say that they were wrong, you've got to prove it. What evidence does Mr. Frost give to show that the disciples were wrong? Well, none, because he believes they were right. At least somehow, some way, they were right, because he says, upon hearing of the destruction of the temple and its buildings, that carried with it a grand annihilation of the world. Where is Mr. Frost's proof that the destruction of the temple carried with it the idea of the annihilation of the world? Where is his proof? Well, he doesn't offer it. Now notice, he continues, quote, Jesus had pointed to the temple mount from where they stood on the Mount of Olives, which was east. From this view, Jesus, you got to pay attention to this, Jesus is not simply saying that the temple would be raised, but that not one stone would be left upon another that will not be destroyed. That's not all that he said, Frost says. Rather, quote, see all these things, unquote. Jesus is speaking of the greater destruction than just a building. And to this, he adds, to this then the disciples connect the parable of the end of the age, Matthew 13:38 and following, when the wicked will be plucked out of the kingdom. In that kingdom, the field is the world, wherein the Son of Man sows seed, which are the sons of righteousness. There are also sons of the evil one, which both grow together until the sons of the evil one are plucked out of the world, wherein the sons of righteousness shine. Thus, hearing Jesus speak of complete annihilation, inferred the end of the nation. Folks, what complete annihilation did Jesus refer to? Did Jesus infer the annihilation of the world? No, he did not. And Mr. Frost offers not a syllable of proof of that. But he says, Jesus has something far greater than the destruction of the buildings in mind. Well, let's see. Notice that Jesus has just predicted the destruction of the temple in Matthew chapter 23. As they're walking out of the temple, the disciples begin to show Jesus the beauty and the size of the stones of those buildings. To which Jesus said, now, watch this, do you not see all of these things? Mr. Frost wants us to believe that all of these things refers to the cosmos, the physical world. Mr. Frost demands that we ignore the context, that we ignore it, and ignore the fact that the disciples are pointing to the temple, to the stones of the temple, and wants us to ignore the fact that Jesus said, do you not see all of these things? All of what things? The temple, the city. We're supposed to ignore that and to believe, without a syllable of proof, that Jesus has in mind the entire world. Well, but wait a minute. Where's the evidence? Where's the text for saying and believing that all of these things is not limited to the destruction of that temple and those buildings? Where's the evidence that that is not the end of the age? Now remember, the disciples are linking the end of the age with that destruction. And Mr. Frost says, yes, that prediction of the destruction of the temple brought to mind to the disciples the annihilation of the world. But he offers us no proof. So Mr. Frost is tacitly admitting the disciples admit that the destruction of the temple brings to mind to the apostles the end of the age. Well, remember, folks, the Christian age has no end. Christian age hadn't even begun yet. How can it bring to mind the destruction and the end of the Christian age when the Christian age had not begun and that temple did not represent the Christian age? Keep in mind, folks, that old covenant temple, and even Kenneth Gentry agrees with this, by the way, that temple represented the old covenant and the old covenant age. Folks, it did not represent the Christian age in any way. So for Mr. Frost to say, well, upon hearing of the destruction of the temple, the disciples automatically thought about the end of the Christian age. You talk about eisegetic, that is one of the worst examples of hermeneutical abuse that one could possibly conceive of. Now watch. What were the disciples and what was Jesus talking about when they pointed out the stones of the temple? Well, that's pretty obvious, isn't it? In the parallel account of Mark chapter 13, as they went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher," now watch this, watch the language of the text, not what Mr. Frost is reading into it, not what Mr. Frost is leaving out, but pay attention to the text. "Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here." Jesus answered and said, pay attention to the text, "Do you see these great buildings?" You see, these great buildings stands in the place of, do you not see all these things? All of these things in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 2 is the buildings that the disciples have been pointing out. It's not the physical creation. Do you see these great buildings? Now watch, not one stone shall be left upon another of what? These buildings. Do you not see all these buildings? Not one stone shall be left standing on top of another. The question is, where does Mr. Frost get the annihilation of the world from this? He gets it out of his own mind. It's not in the text. He gets it out of his presuppositional view that the end of the age is the end of the Christian age, which has no end. And so Mr. Frost wants us to believe that all of these things do not point simply to the fall of the temple. Mark chapter 13 falsifies that claim. Do you not see all of these buildings? Refers to all of these things in Matthew chapter 24. And thus I say again, you will seldom find a worse case of eisegetic hermeneutic than Mr. Frost's brief paragraph or two on page 23 of his book, The Parousia of the Son of Man. He begins by dividing between the parousia and the end of the age. He advances to the assumption that the end of the age is the end of the Christian age. He advances then to the idea that the disciples link the end of the Christian age to the destruction of that temple, which represented not the Christian age, but the Old Covenant age. He ignores that, completely ignores it. That is inexcusable. And listen, folks, we got a whole lot more on this. In the meantime, let me recommend that you get a copy of my book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, in which I discuss all of this extensively. I discuss what the temple was about, whether or not it represented the end of time, the end of the Christian age, that is, its destruction. And along with it, get a copy of my book, Into All the World, Then Comes the End. Now, as I've suggested earlier in the week, guess what? I've got a very special price for you for the month of July 2019. This special price does not apply to overseas orders, I'm sorry, but regular price, if you purchase them separately, would be over $40. July 2019, special price, full price, $30 delivered to your door. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. There's a tab, a banner right at the top. Just click it, and it'll show you how to order. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's morning musings. You have a safe weekend. I'll see you on the flip side.